I do try very hard not to think about how I am seen, because I think that's poison for a writer. Writers are good at their craft when they're good at observing other people and seeing the world for what it is.
Thank you so much for being here with me at Kerner Hall, Rebecca. Welcome.
Thank you for having me. Hi, Toronto.
I want to start with the title. Katabasis is a Greek word meaning a journey or descent into the underworld. Can you talk a bit about the moment that you were deciding to venture into this story? Because I understand that you were also planning a wedding and doing a lot of PhD work around the time that you were doing this novel. These are very different things to be doing all at the same time.
Yeah, I started thinking about hell a lot at the same time that I started my PhD. I had the worst first semester of my PhD ever, and I know for most people this is true, but in my case it was especially true for a lot of personal reasons. When my then boyfriend, now husband, when we got our PhD offer letters, we thought, this is it, like we've been let into paradise. The PhD is a promise of 5, 6, 7 years of funding on a beautiful campus where your only duties are to teach and to take classes and to research the thing that is most exciting to you, and read cool books and talk about people about their ideas. Like that's awesome. And we thought, this is great, like we'll never be worried about anything ever again. And then the PhD started, and then Bennett got really, really sick. He started losing a lot of weight. We couldn't figure out what it was. We saw a lot of doctors, tried all sorts of diets. He just kept getting worse and worse. And finally, we got him admitted to the ER, and they hospitalized him right away. And he was diagnosed with a chronic illness that there's no cure for. It can be managed. Sometimes it's better, sometimes it's a lot worse, but that was our new reality, and it was very tough. We missed most of our classes. We were driving him to the hospital all the time. I was driving back and forth between New Haven and Boston and just sobbing at the wheel most days. And my mental health plummeted, and he was really struggling, and this life that we thought we were going to have felt like it had just totally slipped away, and we were in our own personal hell. So it was tough, and he got better, and we got better, and by the spring semester, things were looking up again, and that's when I started writing what I thought was a totally unrelated, cute little rom-com even, which is how I pitched it to my editor to begin with, a little traipse through the underworld as a satire of the academy. And it wasn't until I started writing and meditating on why the main characters, Alice and Peter, like why they're in hell, why they've chosen this path as opposed to every other option, that I realized this book is actually my way of writing through the trauma of that first semester. So it's titled Katabasis, The Journey to the Underworld, and that's because it's short and pithy, but it really should be titled Katabasis Anabasis, because the second word means the hero's ascent, climbing out of the pits. And I was mentally climbing out of the pits of hell when I was working on this book, and I think we got there.
That's a truly harrowing story to have to be dealing with so many of those different things, like such deep concern for your partner's well-being, the confusion that comes along with kind of interrogating this chronic illness for which there's no cure, not knowing what your future is going to look like after you've had all these ideas about this future that you were building together. And it's fascinating to me that you write this story that, as you say, you kind of thought was a rom-com, but actually was perhaps something darker, deeper, more complex, in which you're constructing this version of hell. And the hell in Katabasis has 8 courts of hell. It's kind of similar to the idea of Dante's 9 circles. It also takes inspiration from a lot of, I would say, Eastern versions of what the underworld or afterlife might be like. There's some Buddhist thought that comes in. Much of it has only been theorized until Alice and Peter actually venture there, right? Hell is a place that obviously we as members of the living, if it exists, we don't know what it is. We can't go there. We can only imagine. But in your version of hell, it's a campus. This is a reveal that kind of comes in. pretty early on in the novel. It's very similar to the Cambridge that they know in the world above. Why make their hell a familiar environment to them?
Yeah, to be clear, not every hell is a campus, just Alice and Peter's hell is a campus. And I'd read a lot of theories of the afterlife, but one interesting anthropological argument I came across was often visions of the afterlife are just mirror visions of what the deceased was familiar with. I mean, Egyptian pharaohs thought that they were going to die and then open their eyes and be surrounded by their favorite servants and their pets and the food and music they liked when they were alive. And a lot of Chinese Buddhist, like bureaucratic visions of hell just look like mirror versions of the Chinese bureaucracy at the time, but with a lot more like fire and demons. So I'm interested in how like humans are so attached to certain social patterns and pieces of architecture that they think even the afterlife must have all these things, even though when you think about it, that's totally irrational. The afterlife should be a totally different realm altogether. And one argument why the afterlife might be a mirror is that the punishments of hell would only make sense if it's in a moral universe that is familiar and intelligible to you. If you just get tossed into hell and it's like a desert landscape in flux with flames and like tridents, I don't know, you might be so unmoored that you never learn your lesson. But if you just have to go through a courthouse, you're like, oh, I know what a courthouse is. This is where they tell me I did something really bad and I nod and admit that I did. So Alice and Peter are sent to a campus because that is the limits of their moral universe.
I thought quite a lot while reading Katabasis about what my personal hell might be according to those limits that you say. I think for me it might be a house party that you're trying to leave and you can't get out. And you're like moving to the door and you're really trying to get to your shoes. What would your personal hell be? Would it be a campus as for Peter and Alice, or is it something else, do you think?
I spent a lot of time thinking about this. I know exactly what it is, at least my personal nightmare. It is a room with no doors or windows. It's just concrete walls on every side. And it's just me, and I can't get out, and I can't change, and I can't die. It's just me and my thoughts forever. I have been terrified of this vision since I was a child. And also, like, my childhood vision of heaven was also deeply terrifying to me. I grew up Christian. I attended a very denominationally irresponsible Chinese Christian church. It was less a proper church and more a excuse for all the Chinese immigrant families to do potluck and read the Bible together, but we were always like borrowing space from other churches. We didn't have a space of our own, so sometimes we were Methodist, sometimes we were Presbyterian. To me, growing up, like all these words were just like synonyms for Christian. I still don't really know the difference. This is background to explain why, so children's Bible study was this pedagogically haphazard thing where we just read passages and tried to make out what was going on. So at some point we were learning what heaven and hell were, and as I understood it, hell's where you go if you didn't believe in God and were really bad and they would just torture you forever. And heaven was a place where you went if you were good and believed in God, and in heaven you got to eat chocolate cake forever with all your friends. This horrified me. I remember this one night so clearly. We had just seen the film $1 Million Baby starring Hilary Swank. It was one of the first films in which the main character died, and so 5-year-old me was really freaked out about death that night, and I kept thinking, oh, but there's the afterlife, but then there's heaven, but heaven is just chocolate cake. And then I ran down to my parents' bedroom crying, and they asked, what's wrong? Were you scared by the movie? And I said, no, what if I get bored by chocolate cake? And I didn't cognize it in these terms at the time, but I think what I'm really terrified of is grasping eternity, persisting for that long without the possibility of reincarnation, rebirth, change, growth, or even just annihilation, persisting as myself forever. I think as a standard fantasy, that sounds pretty nice, but when you consider what that would mean and the exhaustion of the millennia without any reprieve is horrible. So my hell is really eternal persistence.
there's this bargain that Alice and Peter make in your novel, where in order to get to hell as living people, they have to give up half their lifespans. I think a lot of us would find the idea of giving up half of our remaining lives to be pretty horrifying. It's like, that's so, you don't even know what you're giving up. But then at the same time, there's bargains that we make every day, I would say, about our health, about university students, who risk their health to meet deadlines, staying up way later than they should. There's this pressure, I think, for a lot of academics to really sacrifice parts of themselves to succeed. Is that something that you've experienced in academia? Is that like a culture that you've seen yourself? Because Peter and Alice really live this kind of ascetic lifestyle where they're subsisting on lembas bread that's just the most calorically dense material that they can have, and they're not sleeping properly. What do you think about that?
Yeah, I think there is a fetishization of burnout, and I think people perform the burnout to seem more virtuous than others. And it's wrapped up in all these ideas about embodiment and independence from the body. But I think a lot of PhD students do like to pretend that they don't have bodily needs, they don't need entertainment, they are totally independent of the need for food or sleep, or they don't have guilty pleasures. They only exist to do the research, and that lifestyle is very celebrated. That lasts probably through the first semester, and then everyone's just ordering pizza and watching Gilmore Girls. So I think on the flip side, there's also this fetishization of I'm such a helpless slob, and I can barely manage to live my life while I'm also doing my research. I do think actually that the most successful PhD students figure out pretty fast that your body actually needs to be healthy and thriving, and you do need to be happy if you're going to be able to focus on your work. So I've never pulled an all-nighter. I love sleeping. I felt that my husband and I have Letterboxd accounts, which is this movie review app, and you can put tags on movies in Letterboxd, and Bennett has a tag that says Becky slept. There's over 100 movies where I fell asleep in the theater. I fell asleep during Lawrence of Arabia. It's still the best film I've ever seen. I just refuse to push my body past the limit where I can't think anymore, because it doesn't make you a better researcher. It just makes you perform this parody of a successful PhD student. But the people who are doing the best work that I know in their fields, are addicted to rock climbing, are usually runners, are really happy, they have wide social circles, they get excited to do things that are not their research. The representation of academia in this book is an exaggeration. I'd like to think that today's PhD students, though deeply unhealthy about almost everything else, they do make time to go to the climbing gym.
Mm-hmm. It's interesting that you describe the importance of making space for these self-care activities, for these pursuits outside of academia. Something in your background that I find fascinating, just because I was kind of forged in the same fire, is the fact that you come from the world of competitive high school debating, which I think is an environment that attracts similar types of people to this curious academic environment that you describe in this novel.
It attracts theater kids who don't have charisma.
Yeah. Yeah. Or can't sing. Exactly. I knew some people who did both, to be fair. I won't slander all debate kids as charismatic, vacuums. But how do you feel that environment shaped you at all? I think there's some ways in which I feel that the way you talk about language in this novel and in Babel and some of your other work seems to maybe be informed by the fact that you spent a lot of time as a young person thinking really carefully about the power of language.
Yeah, I owe almost everything in my life to high school debate, not least of which is my marriage. I met my husband in the office of our high school debate coach. He was shorter than me at the time, and we shook hands, and he said, "This is so intimidating." And then 11 years later, our coach officiated our wedding. And a lot of my closest friendships still come from that world, which is such an intense, weird, and wonderful world. And I think a couple of things I took away from it that are most directly applicable to how I write are first, the all-consuming passion you have for the activity. when I think about my adolescence, there's pre-debate and post-debate. And once I got the debate bug, it was like everything else fell away. I didn't want to go to parties. I didn't want to go on vacation. I just wanted to prep for debate tournaments, and that was exhilarating to me. It became my entire social world. All my competitors were also my closest friends, and we had such like weird psychosexual rivalries. Debationships is a term, and like you think like celebrity relationships are interesting. When the best girl debater and best boy debater get together, because it always happens, it's like, at least when I was in high school, that was like what Facebook drama lived for. And yes, I was in one of those relationships, and then we didn't even like kissing each other, and then many years later he came out. And I'm so happy for him. So it's a crazy world. And the intensity of it, I think, is only matched by high school sports, like the sheer adrenaline of like winning a state championship. So there's a show called Riverdale and there's a scene where Archie's like, so you've never known the highs and lows of a high school football.
This is a quote I say all the time. I was like, I'm so ready to hear it. So you've never known the epic defeats and victories, the epic highs and lows of high school football?
Yes, yeah. Exactly. And most people don't unless you debated and you've been there in a cerebral way. So I think just having felt that range of intense, weird feelings that many high schoolers, unless they're competing at the same level, don't feel, that makes very rich writing material that a lot of is channeled directly into the Poppy War. Like in the first book, there is a tournament scene during the exams where they're organized in a bracket and they're fighting each other, and that's just like how high school was. So that's the first thing. And the second thing is, when you're, at least in my format of debate, you have very little time to convince 3 or 5 people that you're right. So something you practice a lot is what we call word economy, but basically you're chasing those perfect like 5 or 10 words that will cut through the chase and rise above all the other fluff that's been uttered in the conversation and stay in your judge's mind. Like you're looking for that connective thread to the audience and the magic words that will make these people think I am right. And when you spend years and years thinking about the magic words, that I think translates pretty well into a compelling writing style as well. You don't waste time going down side quests. You're on point all the time.
I'm curious about this like competitive drive that you describe as it's something that's so all-consuming for you that it became your whole life. Is there a way in which that drive sort of manifests in your life as it is now as an academic and as a novelist?
Yeah, I really like to get better at writing. I think the nice thing about not being in high school, though, is that it's not about winning trophies anymore. It's actually really wonderful to be at the point in your life where you look at a high school trophy and it's kind of rusted and you don't care and it hasn't held value for you in a long time. There's a passage of the novel where Alice is breaking up with a boyfriend in her undergrad program. And it's one of the only times in the novel when Alice is right. But they're basically breaking up because she's been ignoring him to work on her grad school applications. And the boyfriend says, well, you're just chasing gold stars. You're chasing those pats on your head. You're such a teacher's pet. And Alice thinks, no, like that's so juvenile. At the point where you're applying to grad school, really, it's not about gold stars anymore. It's not about trophies. It's about that sheer high of discovery. Like the external things are nice, but only insofar as they enable you and give you the resources to pursue those spinning ideas that you have seen glimpses of, but which you want to get closer and closer to. So I think I've made that transition myself. That drive is there, but it is not about beating other people, which is a very childish way to like motivate you to have that drive. It's surely about curiosity and this desire to push my craft as far as it can go during my short time on this world.
It's interesting the phrase that you used of like, this is one of the only times in the book that Alice is right, when she's breaking up with this person because she realizes that her pursuit of knowledge and her desire to work on these grad school applications is perhaps more important than this undergrad relationship that for her felt perhaps quite shallow. You do write these characters that are often wrong, I would say. Like, you know, in each of your books, you have at least one character that feels really easy to loathe, often a central character, but who's intriguing because they have to kind of justify their own actions to themselves consistently throughout the book as part of the narrative. In Katabasis, we have this like really harsh and unforgiving professor character, Professor Grimes, who Alice and Peter want to find, and that Alice and Peter find themselves often perhaps behaving immorally in service of like wanting to impress him as well. Like there's almost this corrupting moral influence that comes from him. How do you feel about Grimes as a character? Like how did you want to construct him? And I don't know, like he drives so much of the action of this novel. These people are willing to literally cut half their lives away, possibly give their lives up entirely for him.
Have you seen Succession?
Absolutely.
He's like Logan. He's not even present for most of the book, but everybody is so obsessed with pleasing him, with his opinions of them, and they are always crawling back to him like dogs who have been kicked. So I was thinking about that dynamic, but more importantly about bad teachers and the students that stay with bad teachers. And it's a question I've been reflecting on more and more as I've made the transition myself from being the student in the first few years of my PhD coursework to having passed my qualifying exams, being a teacher now. These days, most of the time when I'm in a classroom, I'm at the front of the classroom. I wrote the syllabus. I had to prepare that day's discussion notes. And it is very exciting, but like undergraduates look younger and younger and more vulnerable to me these days. And I think a lot about what I owe to them and how to be a good teacher. And I also notice there's this magical intimacy that you feel in a classroom, the bond you have with your students that properly channeled can make for a really awesome learning experience for everybody, but is also very easy to corrupt or take advantage of and exploit, and Grimes does do that. Has anybody seen the film Whiplash by Damien Chazelle? It's really amazing. It's about a drumming student played by Miles Teller and his music teacher who is abusive in every way, physically, verbally, emotionally. He throws cymbals at Miles Teller's head. He makes him practice until his hands bleed. He berates him in public and humiliates him. And the fascinating thing about that movie is Miles Teller keeps coming back. And having like witnessed and been in these teaching dynamics myself, I'm fascinated in what compels that student. And there are a couple of things. The first is like you think that this teacher is the only one who can push you to achieve greatness, that these teaching methods are justified, that only this can unlock your full potential. And second, which is the saddest, most perverse logic of all, the abuse makes you special. It's like the teacher singled me out. They're not picking on anybody else. Like I'm the one they chose to put through this ordeal, and that is a compliment to me. And that is the cage of delusion that Alice and Peter are trapped in as they're trying to impress and rescue Grimes.
Rebecca, I want to turn to a more positive aspect of academia and ask you about some of your own academic work. In addition to being a novelist, you're getting your PhD at Yale, and my understanding of your dissertation is that you're exploring the exchange between Sinophone and Asian American writers who are writing mostly in English. This is something that you're also kind of unpacking in your fiction. Again, as I've mentioned before, like the focus on language is really apparent, and on who gets to speak for a community is really apparent in so much of your work. As an Asian American writer who also is fluent in Chinese and does literary translation, do you find yourself mediating between these two different worlds, or how do you see the relationship between those worlds?
There's just a lot of generative magic at the borders. My dissertation is about Trans-Pacific Cultural Capital, which is a lot of long words, really to try to bridge the like historically siloed literary movements of Chinese American fiction written in English and modern contemporary Chinese fiction written in Chinese, and we understand them as separate literary movements because one is usually housed in American studies or in the English department, and the other is housed in Asian studies, East Asian languages and literatures, etc. So the way I always describe my dissertation is I'm looking at the capital that is generated in the movement of people. So for instance, Chinese authors who have come to the US and taken on new identities writing in English, such as Yiyun Li or Ha Jin. So the movement of people, the movement of texts that cross the border and are translated and take on different contexts and reach new audience, and the travel of language. So what happens when Chinese terms become popular in English parlance, vice versa, when authors writing in both languages do bilingual citations to prove something about their heritage or to make an argument, or doing like cultural sociology about the language. So the upshot of all of this is that there's just a lot of magic that's generated by the movement and the crossing back and forth. I don't see it as something that needs mediation so much as just constant translation. I received a similar question a few days ago in Seattle when somebody asked, how do you harmonize between Eastern and Western cultures, or how do you feel really comfortable bridging everything? And I actually don't think harmony is the goal. We're not looking for that steady state where all cultures are equal and everything is in agreement. Like, languages and cultures are just different ways of experiencing the world and different ways of moving through it. So what's interesting is where they clash and how you translate that, how you have to stretch and play with language to make those untranslatable moments legible.
I mean, one way in which we see interdisciplinarity at play in your work actually is through the incorporation of a lot of talk about formal logic, philosophy, ethics that comes into Katabasis. And I think I'm not reading too much in to say that a lot of this seems to come from your husband, and the book is actually dedicated to him. The dedication is to Bennett, brilliant, beloved. I understand you consulted with him and some of his friends that he's met in his academic circles in writing this novel. What has his mark been on your work?
Well, he thinks everything is about him, but this book really is about philosophy and logic, and I don't do any of those fields, but I have absorbed a lot of it through osmosis by virtue of hosting many of the MIT philosophy department parties, and just like being curious in what other people are working on. So when I started writing the novel, like, a lot of it came from conversations with Bennett about mortality and chronic illness and logic. But once I constructed the magic system, and Bennett's like, that's not one of his areas of concentration either. So he was like, you really should talk to the logicians. So we threw a party called the Paradox Party and invited over a bunch of logicians. And I explained to them the skeleton of the magic system and the arc of the book. And I asked everybody to come prepared with a logic paradox that could plausibly become a spell at a crucial moment in the story. And people came really prepared because famously, I am a very good chef, and they understood that the deal was a paradox for dinner. So people had printed handouts. Like, we have a whiteboard in our living room because most parties devolve into somebody maniacally drawing a diagram on the whiteboard. So there are like fantastic photos from this night of people diagramming their paradoxes and like other people raising their hands to ask questions. And they're all thanked in the acknowledgments of this book. But this book, more than the others, was a really fun exercise in just being taught cool things by scholars who are very passionate about what they do and translating it in a way that was both legible to me and legible to a reader who has no background in any of this.
You mentioned chronic illness as one of the things that you talked about with Bennett that was generative in the writing of this novel, and that's something that does show up in the novel through this character of Peter, who in the book is Alice's big academic rival. Also, they do have that kind of like passionate, harkening back to the debationship relationship thing or academic relationship thing that you mentioned earlier, like real twin flame kind of vibe going on for a lot of it, that they are just fascinated by each other's minds and love bouncing ideas off of one another. But Peter as a character also struggles with balancing a chronic illness that he has and this academic work. What is his character arc like in this book? And you were mentioning earlier that you have some things to say, I guess, about the fallibility of the body that you put into this novel. I would love to hear more about that.
So for most of the novel, we only see Peter through Alice's eyes, and our understanding of him is characterized by lightness and ease. Alice is this dogged, determined, and really put down upon character for whom everything feels hard. And when she looks at Peter, she sees this guy who's the child of academics, who seems like he's never struggled with anything in his life. He just sort of swans into any room he's in, and people adore him and fawn over his work, and he's the darling of the department, and everyone thinks he's like guaranteed to get any job he wants. He never seems to try hard at any exam or any field of study. He just gets it right away, and people never see him working long hours in the lab or crying over a stack of papers. He just like appears and everything is done, and everything was so easy. And I don't want to spoil too much about his character, but as the book goes on, we see that leaning into this perception has been his coping mechanism for not being defined by a chronic illness, that instead of letting these inconsistencies and absences mar his career, he tries very hard to cloak himself in the glamour of the erratic male genius instead. But the reasons why that's necessary are very tragic.
I think a lot of this book is about the human capacity to fail and to be able to kind of show failure. That can feel so counterintuitive, to accept failure when you're in a place like Cambridge in your novel. What does it mean to fail in an environment like that, and how does one make peace with it?
Bro, like, you tell me. I think what's very hard is that nobody is public about their failure, and to have your failure known is terrifying because it becomes departmental gossip, right? Like, you never want that stain on your reputation. You don't want to be the person who failed your translation exam, who got bad feedback on your second year paper, who got passed over for a fellowship, who, like, people aren't even open about what jobs they're applying for, because if you say, I'm applying to this job, and then you don't get it, people will know that you were rejected. So it creates this community where you only ever see other people's published articles and their conference acceptances, and you see them, succeeding as they progress through their coursework, but there is no handbook for what happens when things don't go your way. And things have often not gone my way in my PhD journey, and that's very typical. I just don't talk about it. But I actually am working on getting better at that, like being open about failures and setbacks within my cohort, because those are actually fantastic learning opportunities. They're data points to understand, like, I was not preparing for this exam in the right way, or I really needed to work on how I framed this chapter, and that's why my advisor hated it. So I think I'm still learning how to not feel like the world has ended when I get a piece of bad feedback, and just understand, no, like, I just need to revise this and everything will be fine. And I do think, at least in my department, we would all benefit more from treating this as a totally normal thing that happens and supporting each other through it, rather than like retreating to our rooms to cry about it in private.
So you have that academic world that you're inhabiting, but then also you're in the publishing world, a world that also comes with like its fair share of successes and failures, that for every, really meaningful breakthrough that a writer has, there's often a string of rejections that are unseen, that are not spoken of. How do you kind of see yourself, I guess, fitting into these discourses around like failure and success, who deserves to get an NYT best-selling book in the literary world? I know that's a tough question to be like, talk about your own role in this, but I don't know. You're like, not to be like, you're so successful for one so young, the worst thing anyone can ever say to anybody, but you are.
I just try not to think about it. I do try very hard not to think about how I am seen, because I think that's poison for a writer. Writers are good at their craft when they're good at observing other people and seeing the world for what it is, and quietly standing in a corner of the room and figuring out a phenomenon, a social current, behavioral patterns in other people, verbal patterns, and creating a story around that. I think it is fatal to become so obsessed with your self-image, and this is an easy thing to say, but everybody is really anxious about how they come off and what the public is saying about them. But you learn absolutely nothing from thinking about that. There's an essay that I really like to cite on this topic. It's Sally Rooney's essay about her time doing competitive debate.
One of my favorite essays of all time. Everyone should read it. Even If You Beat Me, I'm Still the Best, I think is the title, if you haven't read it.
Even If You Beat Me. Yeah, and there's a passage in it where she says, trying to get good in an activity teaches you a lot. Teaches you about the activity, about your competitors, about the topics that you're preparing to debate over. That's good for you. Winning only teaches you about yourself. And I come back to that a lot because there is a narcissism from being at the top, which is fatal because it silos your observational powers to the pretty boring and ephemeral topic of what is the press saying about me? And the more I can put that out of my mind and just live a normal life where I am watching other people and not thinking about people watching me, I think the better my work is. And I always I get so bored when an artist puts out an album or a novel about fame. I like Taylor Swift's music. Reputation is her worst album because it is just obsessed with rumors about her. She got so much better when she put out Folklore and Evermore, where she returns to spinning stories about other people's lives and being a storyteller and not a narcissist. I get so sad when writers post exclusively about their reputations. It's so boring.
You've had eras in your career, as Taylor Swift has, one might argue, right? You seem to constantly be working on something, and I know it seems like you have other projects on the horizon, that it kind of seem to have come out of hell a little bit in your description of what the process of writing this book was like in terms of some of the issues in your life that you were working through Katabasis. Was there a light at the end of the tunnel for you in the process of writing this book that you saw, and what are you looking to in the future? What's exciting you these days, I guess?
Visual art. I have a therapist now, which she's great. And I told her I was very anxious to go on tour because I am actually quite shy and introverted, and I was dreading the prospect of having to talk about myself and my process for weeks and weeks. And she asked if there was another art form that I like to do, and there is. I was a painter and a drawer before I started writing. I used to spend most class sessions doodling in the margins of my worksheets, and it was always hot elves on the brink of death. In middle school, I bet my mom probably stole these composition books, but I just filled up whole notebooks with these really lovingly rendered scenes of handsome elves being shot or stabbed, or I got really good at the little blood dribble on the chin, that little detail that's oh, he is not gonna make it. And I can't find them anymore. And I know when they moved, my mom stole them all and probably looks at them sometimes. But I used to think I was going to be a graphic novelist or be an artist. And I think once I got into debate and just more interested in writing, that fell away. And I hadn't picked up my drawing pencils in a decade. But I went back and I've thrown myself into visual art again. I'm painting again. I'm playing with oil pastels. I am doing these cute little graphite drawings of most locations I've been on tour. And that's really fun because one of the next fiction projects I am working on is about artists, so it's just good to learn that vocabulary and good to learn to see the world in terms of composition and values and brush strokes and all that. But more importantly, having an art form that is not tied to professional success, that I never have to show people, that has no expectations attached, has created this sense of creative risk-taking and freedom again that I hadn't felt in a while. And the best part is when you feel that about drawing, that seeps back into the writing as well, and it's making my writing weirder and more visually oriented and less afraid. So yeah, I'm just very excited about new ways of looking at the world.
Well, that took me to a very unexpected place. This conversation has taken me to so many unexpected and delightful places. Rebecca, I want to really thank you from the bottom of my heart for such a wonderful, thoughtful, eloquent conversation, for all of your remarks. Everyone, please give a warm round of applause for R.F. Kuang.